In the tense spring of 1967, the Middle East became a powder keg waiting for a spark. The Six-Day War, one of the most dramatic and consequential conflicts of the 20th century, was about to erupt. For Israel, a small nation surrounded by hostile neighbors, survival was always uncertain. For the Arab states, led by Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, the goal was simple but uncompromising: the elimination of Israel. The clash that was coming would not only reshape the map of the region but also alter the balance of power for generations. The roots of the war stretched back to the years following Israel's independence in 1948. In the 2 decades since, tension never truly faded. Border skirmishes, infiltrations, artillery duels, and terrorist raids had become part of daily life. Israel fought to secure its existence, while the Arab nations, still reeling from the humiliation of 1948, vowed revenge. Among them, Egypt was the strongest and most influential, led by the charismatic President Gamal Abdel Nasser. By the mid-1960s, Nasser had become the symbol of Arab nationalism, rallying millions with his fiery speeches promising the liberation of Palestine and the destruction of Israel. But the tensions of 1967 did not appear overnight. They were the result of a chain of provocations, alliances, and miscalculations that spiraled out of control. Syria played a particularly dangerous role. From the high ridges of the Golan Heights, Syrian artillery regularly shelled Israeli villages, disrupting life in the fertile valleys below. Farmers plowing their fields risked sniper fire, children walking to school dashed for cover at the sound of explosions. Each Israeli protest at the United Nations was met with Syrian defiance. At the same time, Palestinian guerrillas, operating with Syrian support, infiltrated Israel, planting bombs, ambushing patrols, and terrorizing civilians. The Israelis viewed this not just as harassment but as a deliberate attempt to keep the border aflame. By May 1967, events took a dramatic turn. False Soviet intelligence reports claimed that Israel was preparing to attack Syria. In response, Nasser mobilized the Egyptian army. He ordered divisions into the Sinai Peninsula, placing them just miles from Israel's southern frontier. This alone was a massive provocation, but he did not stop there. On May 16, Nasser demanded that the United Nations remove its peacekeeping force, which had been stationed in the Sinai since 1956. Shockingly, the UN Secretary-General complied, and within days, the blue-helmeted soldiers were gone. Suddenly, Israel faced Egyptian troops directly across its border with no buffer in between. The situation escalated further on May 22, when Nasser made his boldest move yet: he closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. This act was, for Israel, a declaration of war. The Straits were Israel's vital sea link to Asia and Africa, allowing oil shipments to flow from Iran and trade routes to remain open. Without access, Israel's economy and security were in jeopardy. Israeli leaders, including Prime Minister Levi Eshkol and Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, recognized that their nation could not tolerate this blockade. Yet they hesitated. Israel was strong militarily, but its leaders feared isolation. Would the United States or other Western powers intervene? Or would Israel be forced to act alone? Meanwhile, the Arab world rallied behind Nasser. Jordan's King Hussein, despite his deep mistrust of Nasser, signed a defense pact with Egypt. Iraqi troops began moving toward Jordan to reinforce him. Syria, already prepared for war, boasted of crushing Israel from the north. Radio stations across the Arab world broadcast promises of destruction. In Damascus, Cairo, and Amman, crowds filled the streets, chanting for war. For many Arabs, 1967 felt like the moment when they would finally erase the humiliation of 1948. Inside Israel, the mood was grim but determined. The memory of the Holocaust was still raw, and many Israelis feared that if they lost this war, there would be no second chance. Mothers wept as they sent their sons to the army, unsure if they would return. Ordinary citizens dug trenches, prepared shelters, and stocked food supplies. There was a sense that the very survival of the nation was at stake. At the same time, the Israeli military quietly prepared. The Israel Defense Forces, IDF, though small compared to the massive Arab armies, was well trained, highly motivated, and led by battle-tested commanders. They knew that their only hope was to strike quickly and decisively before the enemy could crush them under sheer numbers. The world watched anxiously. In Washington, President Lyndon B. Johnson urged restraint but offered little concrete support. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, gave full backing to the Arabs, warning Israel that any aggressive move would bring consequences. At the United Nations, debates dragged on with no resolution. Diplomats called for calm, but in the Middle East, the drums of war were deafening. The streets of Tel Aviv grew eerily quiet at night, while in Cairo, crowds cheered as Nasser promised to throw the Jews into the sea. By the end of May, the countdown to war had begun. Israel's cabinet met in long, agonizing sessions, weighing the risks of a preemptive strike. Should they wait to be attacked, as the world expected, or should they launch a surprise offensive to gain the advantage? Military leaders argued passionately for the latter, warning that delay could mean disaster. Every day that passed brought more Arab troops and weapons into position. Every day, Israel's chances of survival grew slimmer. On the morning of June 5, 1967, the decision was made. As dawn broke, Israel launched Operation Focus, a daring preemptive strike against the Egyptian Air Force. Nearly every Israeli combat aircraft roared into the sky, flying low across the Mediterranean to avoid radar. Within hours, the fate of the Middle East would be changed forever. At exactly 7:45 a.m., on June 5, 1967, the skies above the Mediterranean filled with the thunder of Israeli jets. This was Operation Focus, MOKed, the bold gamble that would determine the outcome of the war within its first hours. The mission was simple in concept but daring in execution: destroy the Egyptian Air Force while it was still on the ground. For weeks, Israeli pilots had trained relentlessly, memorizing flight paths, attack angles, and target layouts. Now, with the Arab armies closing in and the blockade strangling Israel, the time had come to unleash their plan. Flying just meters above the waves to evade radar, nearly 200 Israeli aircraft streaked westward before veering south into Egyptian airspace. Their targets were airfields stretching from the Sinai to the Nile Delta. In a carefully coordinated sequence, waves of jets swooped down on Egyptian runways, hangars, and control towers. Bombs designed to crater runways left Egyptian planes unable to take off, while follow-up strikes annihilated MiG fighters, bombers, and interceptors parked helplessly in rows. The effect was devastating. Within 3 hours, nearly the entire Egyptian Air Force, over 250 aircraft, was reduced to twisted wreckage. Command posts were in chaos, and Egyptian pilots who managed to scramble found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered. By noon, Israel had secured total air superiority. In the coming days, they would repeat the same tactics against Syria and Jordan, ensuring that the skies belonged entirely to the IDF. This single stroke changed the war from a desperate gamble for survival into a lightning offensive. With the air war decided, Israel turned to the Sinai, where Nasser's forces, some 100,000 strong with 1,000 tanks, waited for battle. The Egyptian army was formidable on paper but plagued by poor coordination, weak communication, and overconfidence. Israeli generals Yitzhak Rabin and Moshe Dayan believed that speed and maneuver would be the key. Instead of direct frontal assaults, the IDF would strike deep into Egyptian positions, bypassing strongpoints and sowing confusion. The first major clash came at Abu Ageila, a heavily fortified Egyptian stronghold that commanded the central Sinai. Its defenses included minefields, trenches, bunkers, and artillery, all manned by thousands of soldiers. Traditionally, such a position would require days of bloody fighting. But the Israelis crafted a daring plan. General Ariel Sharon, then a divisional commander, orchestrated a combined arms assault that became a textbook example of modern warfare. On the night of June 5, Israeli paratroopers infiltrated behind Egyptian lines, attacking artillery batteries that were supposed to cover the stronghold. At dawn, Israeli tanks launched a frontal assault, drawing Egyptian fire and attention. Meanwhile, engineers cleared minefields under cover of darkness, opening paths for infantry. In one of the most dramatic moments of the war, Sharon's men stormed Egyptian positions in close combat, using grenades and flamethrowers to neutralize bunkers. By the next morning, Abu Ageila had fallen, and with it, the backbone of Egypt's defense in the Sinai collapsed. As word spread, panic rippled through Egyptian ranks. With their air force destroyed and command structures paralyzed, Egyptian units began retreating in disorder. Israeli armored brigades surged forward, seizing key passes and crossroads. Columns of Egyptian vehicles clogged the roads, vulnerable to relentless airstrikes that turned retreats into massacres. Entire divisions disintegrated as soldiers abandoned tanks and fled on foot across the desert. While Abu Ageila was the centerpiece, battles raged across multiple axes. In the north, Israeli forces advanced through the Gaza Strip, encountering stiff resistance from entrenched Egyptian troops. Street fighting broke out in Gaza City, but once again, Israeli mobility and coordination proved decisive. To the south, columns raced toward Sharm el-Sheikh, the strategic port controlling the Straits of Tiran. By June 7, Israeli forces had captured the area, reopening the vital shipping route that Nasser had tried to strangle. Perhaps the most astonishing feature of the campaign was its speed. In just 3 days, Israel shattered the Egyptian army, capturing the entire Sinai Peninsula up to the Suez Canal. Egyptian morale collapsed so completely that Nasser himself, humiliated and overwhelmed, briefly announced his resignation on June 9, only to be persuaded by mass demonstrations to remain in power. The Sinai campaign not only removed Egypt from the battlefield but also demonstrated the effectiveness of Israel's military doctrine, preemption, mobility, and integration of air and ground forces. What had begun as a desperate gamble transformed into one of the most stunning Blitzkrieg-style victories in modern history. Yet while Israel celebrated in the Sinai, the war was far from over. To the east, Jordan had entered the conflict. King Hussein, bound by his pact with Nasser, ordered his forces to shell Jerusalem and move into Israeli territory. Though he had doubts about Egypt's honesty, Nasser had falsely assured him of Egyptian victories. Hussein felt trapped by Arab unity and public expectation. The Jordanians had a strong, well-trained army, including their elite Arab Legion, and their control of the West Bank gave them commanding positions over Israel's narrow central corridor. On the morning of June 5, as Israeli jets bombed Egypt, Jordanian artillery pounded West Jerusalem, striking civilian neighborhoods, government buildings, and even the Knesset. The old city, with its sacred religious sites, became a battlefield once again. For Israelis, who had long dreamed of returning to the Western Wall and other holy places, this was not just a military fight but a spiritual mission. Israeli leaders now faced a critical decision: should they limit their war to Egypt, or should they confront Jordan as well? The risks were enormous. Fighting on multiple fronts could stretch the IDF thin. Yet the danger of leaving Jordanian forces unchecked was too great. By June 6, Israeli counterattacks had begun, setting the stage for one of the most emotional and decisive battles of the war, the Battle for Jerusalem. As dawn broke over June 6, 1967, the battle shifted from the deserts of Sinai to the ancient hills of Jerusalem and the rocky terrain of the West Bank. For centuries, Jerusalem had been fought over by empires, kings, and armies, but now it was once again at the heart of a conflict that was reshaping the Middle East. Jordan, led by King Hussein, had entered the war under immense pressure. Despite his private doubts about Egypt's strength, Hussein felt compelled to act when Nasser broadcast false reports of Egyptian victories. Convinced that Israel was on the verge of collapse, Hussein ordered his army, the respected Arab Legion, to attack. Jordanian artillery rained shells on West Jerusalem, striking homes, schools, and hospitals. Snipers took positions along the old city walls, and for civilians, life became a nightmare of shattered glass, collapsing buildings, and air raid sirens. Israel could not ignore this front. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol and Defense Minister Moshe Dayan gave the order: the IDF must secure Jerusalem and push Jordanian forces back across the Jordan River. The task was given to the Paratroopers, Israel's most battle-hardened unit. For them, this was more than just a military mission. It was a chance to reclaim the heart of Jewish history, the Old City and the Western Wall, lost since 1948. The first major clash occurred at Ammunition Hill, a fortified Jordanian outpost controlling the road between Mount Scopus and central Jerusalem. The hill bristled with bunkers, trenches, and machine guns, manned by determined Jordanian defenders. At dawn on June 6, Israeli paratroopers launched a frontal assault under cover of artillery. What followed was one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Fighting raged trench by trench, bunker by bunker. Grenades, rifles, and even hand-to-hand combat turned Ammunition Hill into a killing ground. For 4 hours, the paratroopers clawed their way forward, paying a heavy price: nearly 40 killed in one battalion alone. Finally, by mid-morning, the hill was taken. The path to East Jerusalem was open, but the victory came at a terrible cost, leaving survivors emotionally scarred by the loss of so many comrades. Meanwhile, in the city itself, Israeli forces pressed against Jordanian positions at the Government House, the Rockefeller Museum, and the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. Street fighting echoed through Jerusalem's narrow roads, with tanks rolling past stone houses and soldiers exchanging fire from rooftops. Civilians cowered in basements, waiting for the end. The Jordanians fought with determination, but they were gradually pushed back as Israeli mobility and air support tilted the balance. On June 7, the decisive moment arrived. At dawn, Israeli paratroopers assembled at Lion's Gate, one of the entrances to the Old City. General Madager, their commander, gave the order to advance. With emotions running high, the paratroopers pushed through, entering streets that had been closed to Jews for nearly 2 decades. Snipers fired from windows, but nothing could stop the momentum. Minutes later, Ger's voice crackled over the radio: Har Habayat Bayadina, the Temple Mount is in our hands. It was a moment of history. For the first time since 1948, Jews had access to their holiest sites. Soldiers wept openly at the Western Wall, pressing their hands against the ancient stones. Rabbi Shlomo Goren blew a shofar, declaring the moment a fulfillment of dreams generations old. For Israelis, the liberation of Jerusalem was not just a military triumph but a spiritual victory that redefined the war. But while Jerusalem captured the world's attention, the broader campaign in the West Bank was equally dramatic. Israeli forces launched multiple armored thrusts across the region, seizing Ramallah, Bethlehem, Jenin, and Nablus in rapid succession. Jordanian resistance was stiff in places, but without air cover and with supply lines collapsing, the Arab Legion could not hold. Within just 2 days, the entire West Bank fell under Israeli control, pushing Jordan's forces back across the river. The capture of the West Bank stunned the Arab world. In just 48 hours, Jordan had lost territory it had controlled since 1948. For Israel, the gains were enormous. Not only did they secure defensible borders along the Jordan River, but they also now held the biblical heartland of Judea and Samaria, places tied deeply to Jewish history. The demographic implications, however, were profound. Israel now ruled over a large Palestinian population, setting the stage for future political struggles that remain unresolved to this day. Internationally, the fall of Jerusalem electrified public opinion. Images of Israeli soldiers praying at the Western Wall spread across the globe. For many Jews in the diaspora, it was a moment of pride and identity, reconnecting them with their ancestral homeland. For Arab leaders, however, it was a humiliation. Radio broadcasts that once boasted of victories now fell silent, replaced by despair and anger. Despite the overwhelming success, Israeli leaders debated their next moves. Should they retain the Old City and the West Bank, or should they use them as bargaining chips for peace? These questions would haunt Israeli politics for decades. But in the heat of June 1967, the focus remained on survival, victory, and the momentum of the battlefield. By June 8, Jerusalem was firmly in Israeli hands, and the West Bank was pacified. King Hussein, recognizing the futility of further resistance, accepted a ceasefire brokered by the United Nations. For Jordan, the war was a catastrophe that permanently altered its role in the Arab-Israeli conflict. For Israel, it was a triumph beyond imagination, a victory that not only secured Jerusalem but also expanded its territory dramatically. The Six-Day War was entering its final phase, but its outcome was already clear: Israel had crushed 3 Arab armies in less than a week. Still ahead lay the battles on the northern front, where Syria and the Golan Heights awaited. The guns of Damascus were still firing, and the war had one last dramatic chapter before it reached its conclusion. While Israel celebrated its stunning victories in Sinai, Jerusalem, and the West Bank, the war was not yet over. To the north, Syria's artillery still pounded Israeli settlements from the towering plateau of the Golan Heights. For years, farmers living in northern Israel had endured constant shelling from these positions. Now, with Egypt and Jordan defeated, the Israeli leadership faced a difficult decision: should they risk an assault on the heavily fortified Golan? The Golan Heights was not just another battlefield. Rising more than 1,000 meters above the Galilee, it gave Syria a commanding position over northern Israel. The terrain was brutal: rocky hills, steep slopes, and deep bunkers. The Syrians had spent nearly 2 decades building a fortress line of trenches, minefields, barbed wire, and concrete pillboxes. Every Israeli soldier knew an attack would mean climbing uphill under relentless fire. But the opportunity was too important to ignore. If the heights could be captured, Israel's northern settlements would finally be secure. On June 9, 1967, the order was given. Israeli artillery unleashed a massive bombardment on Syrian positions, pounding bunkers and trenches for hours. The roar of the guns echoed across the valleys, shaking the ground. At the same time, Israeli jets streaked overhead, striking Syrian strongholds and cutting off supply routes. The air was thick with smoke and dust, signaling the start of one of the war's toughest battles. Israeli infantry units, supported by tanks, began their climb. The soldiers faced machine gun fire, anti-tank weapons, and hidden bunkers. Progress was slow, every meter fought for with blood and determination. At Tel Faher, one of the most heavily defended Syrian outposts, Israeli troops stormed uphill under withering fire. Grenades exploded, bullets whizzed past, and the rocky terrain made movement nearly impossible. Yet, inch by inch, the soldiers advanced, often engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat inside enemy trenches. The cost was high. Entire squads were pinned down, and officers fell while leading charges. But the Israelis pressed on with ferocious determination, inspired by the belief that this was their chance to end years of Syrian aggression. By nightfall, several key positions were in Israeli hands, though at terrible cost. Soldiers collapsed in exhaustion, surrounded by the wreckage of tanks, broken weapons, and the silence of fallen comrades. The next day, June 10, the assault resumed with even greater intensity. Israeli armor forced its way through Syrian defenses, blasting bunkers at point-blank range. Engineers cleared minefields under fire, allowing infantry to move forward. At Tel Azaziat and Banias, fierce battles raged, but the momentum was with the Israelis. By afternoon, Syrian lines began to crumble. Soldiers abandoned their positions, retreating toward Damascus. For the Syrian leadership, the collapse was shocking. Confident in their fortifications, they had not expected such a rapid breakthrough. As Israeli forces surged forward, panic spread through Syrian ranks. Radio broadcasts in Damascus declared a strategic withdrawal, but in reality, it was a desperate retreat. Within hours, the Golan Heights, which had been considered nearly impregnable, was in Israeli hands. By the evening of June 10, the Six-Day War came to an end. Israel had not only defended itself but had achieved a victory beyond imagination. In less than a week, it had destroyed 3 Arab armies, captured Sinai from Egypt, Jerusalem and the West Bank from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. The map of the Middle East was redrawn, and the balance of power had shifted dramatically. The human cost, however, was heavy. More than 20,000 Arab soldiers had been killed, with thousands more wounded or captured. Israel, though victorious, lost around 800 men, a painful price for such a small nation. Families mourned across both sides, even as governments declared victory or lamented defeat. Internationally, the war sent shockwaves. In Western capitals, Israel's stunning success was admired, but concern grew over the territories it now controlled. The United Nations quickly called for negotiations, passing Resolution 242, which introduced the now famous principle of land for peace. Yet in Arab capitals, humiliation turned into anger and calls for revenge. The Khartoum Resolution, passed shortly after the war, declared the three no's: no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. For Israel, the victory was a source of pride and existential relief. The capture of the Golan Heights secured its northern settlements from Syrian shelling. The reunification of Jerusalem gave it control over its most sacred sites. And the expansion of its territory gave it strategic depth it had never known before. But alongside triumph came new challenges: ruling over a large Palestinian population, facing international pressure to withdraw, and preparing for the inevitable backlash from defeated neighbors. In Damascus, Cairo, and Amman, the defeat was felt like an open wound. Leaders who had once promised victory and the destruction of Israel now struggled to explain how their armies had collapsed in just 6 days. In Egypt, Nasser initially announced his resignation, only to be persuaded back into office by mass demonstrations. In Jordan, King Hussein mourned the loss of the West Bank and Jerusalem. And in Syria, bitterness toward Israel only deepened, setting the stage for future conflict. As the guns fell silent, the world struggled to absorb the scale of the change. The Six-Day War had lasted less than a week, but its consequences would echo for decades. The territorial gains created new fault lines, and the sense of unfinished business guaranteed that this was not the last war between Israel and its neighbors. For the soldiers who fought it, the memories of June 1967 remained vivid. Israeli veterans recalled the exhilaration of victory mixed with the sorrow of comrades lost. Arab veterans remembered the chaos, the retreat, and the pain of defeat. The landscapes of Sinai, Jerusalem, and the Golan still bore the scars of tanks, trenches, and craters, a silent testimony to the ferocity of those 6 days. And for the world, the Six-Day War was more than just a military clash. It was a turning point in modern history, reshaping borders, politics, and identities in ways that continue to influence the Middle East today.